Hello, this is ST536, Fundamentals of Information Technology, part of the MST program. I'm Rob Hepler. And today, this lecture, we're going to talk about input. We've been talking about a lot of the different aspects of the computer. The input, of course, is the part we really want to think about. And I want to just talk for a second about conceptually about input before we get into the details of the equipment and so forth. If you think about, let's do this little exercise. Your body, you think about it as a machine. It's kind of trite, but just for a second, let's do that. Close your eyes for a second. Just relax with me here. And think about what are the inputs that go into my body, your body. Well, of course, the obvious one is that I'm breathing. I probably notice that most because of all my allergies and so forth. I have trouble breathing often. But, and then there's also, I know I eat, I have food as input. But let's just think for a second about input that helps me learn about my environment. It helps me move around in my environment. And of course, the oxygen and the food are the energy, are the power I need to keep things running. But the senses, the 5 senses, are the things that tell me about my environment. I first think about, with my eyes closed, I think about my ears. I'm kind of listening to my voice as I talk because I want to control it as much as I can. And I know, and you should know, that there's waves coming out of my mouth. And I have these things on the side of my head, holes in my head, with these flappy things to collect the waves, the sound waves. And the waves are made by the molecules of the air moving in a certain pattern caused by the vibrations. And those waves go into my ear and eventually are input into the processor, my brain. And then, of course, there's the sense of smell. There's 5 of these senses, as you know. The sense of smell is a little different in that it's really not waves it uses. I have these 2 holes in the front of my face as input devices, otherwise known as the nose. And that device processes things that actually move into these 2 holes are molecules. The molecules move across a sensing device, special cells in my nose and my nasal cavity, and it reads what kind of molecules those are and sends them to my processor. So there's a process that goes on. There's an interface, just as there were with my ears. The next one is the sense of taste, very similar to the nose. I have this apparatus inside this hole in my processor, in my machine, called a tongue, and it has specialized cells which also interpret molecules running across it and send certain signals again to my brain. These are all input devices. They're all ways, an interface between my internal processor and my environment. And of course, there's the eyes. That's probably the most important for many of us. Eyes, again, are accepting waves, light waves. And they go inside these 2 holes, which are a little different than the others because these holes are covered by a sack full of fluid, if you will. And the waves go through the air into my eyes, into these input devices. And those waves are converted to signals that are sent to my processor, my brain. And the last sense is touch. And my whole body feels that. The skin is the organ they usually talk about, but we all know that we can feel internally as well. When an explosion here at Tech goes off from Emmertech, I can sometimes feel the sound wave run through my body. I hear the sound, but I also feel it. So I've got this sense of touch. These are remarkable input devices. And I want you to think about, all those input that we just talked about need to go into a computer. And let's think about that. If I'm sitting here in front of a computer, and I will be in just a second, what do I want to have input into that computer? Do I want that computer to learn about its environment? Well, not necessarily. If I want to use the computer as a tool to run something in the environment, and it needs to understand the environment, that's one thing. But for me, to get the computer to do something, all these senses that we talked about are not all that important. What I want to do is be able to tell that computer, I want to do two things really. I want to give it instructions. I want you to do these things. Do them for me. And number two, I want it to accept data for me. Ultimately, all the things we talked about, light, sound, if we want to, taste, touch, all those things can be, on some level, inputs to a computer. But we have to make the decision that we want that to happen. And then we have to make a decision about how we want to interpret those, quote, senses. The other important thing to think about with human input is everything, all the input I'm doing goes into this device in my head called the brain. And the brain interprets everything. The message I am sending to you, the audio message, is being interpreted by everyone listening to this recording differently. Probably the overlap's 95% given the topic, and we all know there's a small subset of information, but each of us is hearing this differently because of our unique interpretation in our brain. Take the eyes, for instance. Recent research has shown that the eyes cannot follow a major league fastball. It's physically impossible. And then have you respond with your hands and the bat. That doesn't happen because it's impossible. By the time a baseball going 100 miles an hour gets into the brain, is interpreted, and the signal is sent to your hands to move the bat in a certain way, the ball has already moved too far for you to respond. And yet, 2 or 3 times out of 10, Major League Baseball players hit that ball. How do they do it? Well, the brain actually interprets the movement of that baseball and creates an image in your brain of where the ball will be. Your hands then respond to that image. That image doesn't exist. It may not exist because the ball may be a curved ball and it will go some other direction than what you assumed. So there's a lot that goes on in the brain, the meanings, the reasons. Computer, of course, has no meaning, has no reason, but we as human beings can use the tool to do what we want, every one of these sorts of signals. So let's take a look at some of these aspects and some of these concepts. More specifically, we're going to look over these things today as we go through. And these are specific things. We're going to talk about hardware. We're going to talk about devices and things. But you know me, I like to talk about the conceptual things first. And let's talk about these sensory organs again. Pretty gruesome diagram. 5 senses: ear, eye, tongue, nose, skin. Current research, by the way, you might be interested to know that taste, actually, you can taste things all the way through the digestive system. And it's one of the things the food industry is using against us right now by adding salt and sugar and fat to our food, because all of the tongue tasted, and there's a thing called mouth appeal, the term they use. It also is tasted all the way through, and that pleasure you get happens because of that. And that's, again, the brain interpreting it. Why is sugar a positive thing? It's because of who we are. There's an eyeball looking at you. That dark part in the middle is the capturing device. It's the input device for our sight. The wave goes into the eye and passes through. And then here's the input interface on the back here. And as the wave hits this, we have ganglion or cells, rods and cones that read the waves differently. In other words, they interpret the waves when they hit them, and they tell the brain what the wave is. Now, there's rods and there's cones. At a ratio of 30 to 1, the cells in our eyes that tell us black and white only, there's 30 times more of those than there are of color. So we see both in black and white and color. Dogs, I'm told, only have the cells that tell it black and white, but they can differentiate tones of gray much better than we can. So we have these things in here, and again, that signal goes where? To the processor, to the brain. I want to point out something else here. If we are looking at the Eiffel Tower, and I'll just draw that like this, letter A, Eiffel Tower, notice the top goes like that, the bottom goes like this, so in fact, the image we get in the back of our eye is upside down. We see the world upside down. That's the truth of it. The lenses just work better that way, and that's the way we evolved. So how does it get turned right side up? The processor. The brain, again, adjusts it for us so that we can see things right side up. And the point I'm making is that this is something a computer wouldn't do. It would just assume that's the reality of it. The eyes do more than that, however. The eyes are actually organs of emotion. Tears. Why does that happen? I don't know. Why don't we have something ooze out of our ears when we're sad or happy? It's just who we are. The computer isn't going to do that. When we have an input device for light on a computer, it's not going to use it for other things. It's just going to be used for one thing. You're not going to be able to interpret what the computer is thinking like you often can by looking at eyes. You can tell from facial expressions in the eyes themselves sometimes what people are feeling. Not important to a computer. The hearing, same thing. The waves go in here in this device. Let me change colors here. And the sound waves bounce back into this very complicated set of bones here, and they move back and forth as the wave moves back and forth, which causes these nerve cilia here to move in certain ways, and then it moves on up the line to the processor. The other thing the ear does, which doesn't relate to senses, is our sense of balance happens in here because there's liquid in there, and if we keep the liquid level, we're balanced. As the liquid moves back and forth, we're not unbalanced, and we'll move to be in balance. So the ear does other things, but it also does the input. Sense of smell, well, you get the idea. The difference here is these are not waves. These are molecules of fried bacon, roses. The molecules drift through the air, not in waves, as particles, and then olfactory bulb here somehow, magically, interprets those molecules and sends, again, signals to the brain. And you can see there's a little more detail. There's actually a part of the brain that the brain actually has specialized parts, and that one of them deals with smell. I just wanted to get the idea that it's a little more complicated than just figuring out what the molecules are. And of course, different smells have different reactions in different cultures. Some cultures like certain smells that other cultures would find just horribly distasteful. There's some cultures that bury food for years, dig it up, and eat it. And Americans, when they smell that food, they just almost get sick. Taste, same idea. There's taste cells, specialized cells. Again, molecules go by the cells, and they send a signal off to the brain. Everything goes somewhere. It's an input somewhere. Sense of touch, again, there's cells that when things move, essentially, it creates a signal which goes up the line to the brain. Of course, there's also heat. We sense heat. That's a wave. Cold, touch, all those things come through this one organ, sense of touch. Again, all those things happen. They go into our brain. We interpret them in certain ways, and things happen. So we as human beings using a computer have to decide what do we want to input to the computer. Computer doesn't really know. It's our decision. We design the computers. So we need to decide what we want to go into the computer and then what we want to do with it. How do we want to interpret it? Remember, the computer is just a piece of metal. It's just a machine. It's just a tool. Here are a bunch of input devices. This is an interesting one. You put your hand down and it scans it. Microphone, pen, iPod type of device of some kind. All kinds of, a credit card reader, anything getting information into the computer. What are the two things you want to do to the computer? And I'm saying two things because as a human being standing here in front of this computer, I want it to do two things and two things only, accept commands. I want to tell it what to do because I want it to do things for me. And number two, I want it to accept my data, like I talked about earlier. Now, an instruction, a command to a computer, can enter three different ways. One, a program, and we'll talk about programming later, is a file containing a list of instructions in a certain order, which we want to have happen. When we open Word, we want it to do certain things, and then we want it to be able to process our documents. Well, the Word, the program, is a file on your hard disk full of instructions for the computer. That's a form of input. Those instructions come from a file. That would be this one. The next is, I want it to do something. Well, this pen is an input device, and when I touch this screen, I want it to make the shape I make, a check mark. That was the program responding to my input. There's a program on here that does that. Sits and waits for this pen to do something, and then it does something appropriately. When I press this button, sends a signal to the same software, pulls instructions out of the program file, and changes the color to red when I press the button, and then when I use the pen, it's red now. And finally, form of instruction is human beings or something responding to a question or a prompt, if you will, from the program. And that happens all the time. When you try to exit Word without saving your work, it'll say, do you want to save your work? And you say yes or no, or cancel. So that's a response. So those are all instructions going into the computer. And of course there's data. That would be the document itself, what you type. That would be my voice going into a microphone and being converted to digits and going into the computer. The video, same thing. Video is being converted going into the computer. So here's a pretty good definition. I wanted anything to enter data or instructions into the computer. Data instructions are both stored where? In RAM and the hard disk in some cases. Keyboard is an input device. And most people would say more data goes in through the keyboard than anything else. The keyboard is used for both instructions and data in a sense. It's really data that gets interpreted as instructions, but we'll call them instructions. There's certain keys across the top. When you press them, certain commands happen depending on the software that's running. Normally, we've just all accepted over the years that if you press F1, it usually brings up help, and so forth. So those are instructions. There's a numeric keypad. The point is, what happens when you press a button, and this is just a group of buttons, remember, nothing magical about it. We just group the buttons this way. It's a group of buttons that when we press any one of these buttons, let's say the letter G here, well, behind and below that button is something that generates a signal that goes into RAM, into a program, Word perhaps, and says, oh, that particular button means this code, whatever the code is for G, it generates it and puts it into RAM. And so that's going on continually while you're typing on the keyboard. And so you're inputting data and sometimes instructions from the keyboard. Some characteristics of the keyboard. These are what we were talking about a minute ago, function keys. Those are program or instructions to the computer. Another concept, they call it under the keyboard, but it's a concept of the system itself. All programs display on the monitor. That's the output device. And in my case, I'm using the monitor as an input device because of this pen. But there's something called a pointer and the insertion point. And this is pretty obvious. We all know this. I just want to make sure you know the terms. or cursor, insertion point or cursor. That's where whatever we're going to do next happens. If it's typed, that's where it goes. You all know this. You've done it billions of times, but those are the terms, just in case you haven't heard them. Nothing magical about that. And how do we get input into the computer via the keyboard? Well, here's some examples. You can send wirelessly what the keyboard input, or you can plug it in. Okay. And there's even some older technology before USB, which people don't use anymore. Okay, not important. Ergonomics. Here's an interesting kind of tidbit. Keyboards. Well, some of you may have never seen one, but you certainly know what they are, I hope. I grew up using a typewriter for my schoolwork, high school, college. And a typewriter allowed you to type on the paper, the same kind of thing you're seeing on the monitor. And there was a keyboard. And remember, a typewriter is a mechanical, physical device that has keys that move and arms that come up and strike a ribbon, and then the ink goes onto the paper permanently when you press a key. So it's a physical device. Well, the keyboard we're using right now is often called the QWERTY keyboard. If you look at the keys on the upper left, that's the order they are, QWERTY. And it's designed so that your index fingers go over the F and the J if you've taken typing, if you're doing touch type. And those are the strongest fingers on your hand, and then it goes down from there. The little finger's the least strong that most of us have. And the thumb isn't very good at doing things either in this sense. It's good at gripping things. So why do you suppose the F and G and the characters around the F and G are there? If this is the strongest finger, it must have been a decision. It was a design. It wasn't done by accident. Well, the truth is they played around with this and they found the most inefficient layout they could find. Because what they found out was that people would get so good if they made the keyboard efficient, they would jam the physical device. The keys striking the paper would get jammed together. So they had to slow them down. They did that by rearranging the keyboard in the least efficient way they could. So all the characters around your strongest fingers are the ones you use least. What a concept. Well, they did that for reasons, physical reasons. Now that we have computers, no physical typing, a guy by the name of John Dvorak, I think that's how you spell it, did an analysis, and he created a Dvorak keyboard and put the most used characters around the index fingers. The speed with which people typed and the accuracy went way up, tremendous. So it's another oddity of computers, again, that we don't use that because there's a trade-off. In order to use a Dvorak keyboard, you'd have to retrain all the people using your keyboards, and the gain would be so minimal. And even when people were entering data with keyboards really at a fast clip, it just wasn't worth it. You had to buy new keyboards, you had to train people, it was very expensive, so we just stuck with it. Now, of course, it doesn't matter too much, because we've all gotten pretty good at typing, so you're not going to see a change there. But those are the kind of things that happen with computers for reasons other than what you might think. Okay. And of course, your mobile devices have keyboards. Sometimes they're touch. Some of them have a physical keyboard, and some of them have kind of a keypad. And we all know how well they work. This is an interesting one here, predictive text. There's blog sites that show how those predictive software have made people say things they didn't mean to say. But they're very important for some. Pointing device. Well, you need those. Tell the computer where you're going to insert something, what you want to do. In fact, sometimes you can use a pointing device to enter a command. When you click on an icon or you click on Microsoft Word icon on the desktop, that's using a pointer to actually enter an instruction. So it's a small symbol on the screen, and then the device moves it around. We call that a cursor, most people. C-U-R, S-O-R, or pointer, as they call it here. And as you move the mouse that pointer moves around. I can also move it with this pen, but I'm going to leave it in pen mode. Okay, you know what that is, no big deal. You know what a mouse is, different kinds of mouses. There are actually mouses that you wear in your hand, and they have a gyroscope, and as you move it around, it moves the pointer around. There's all kinds of different mouses. Point is, they sense your movement of your hand and move the pointer accordingly. Now think about that. There's actually more data going into the computer via the mouse than there is the keyboard, but we don't think about it that way. Every little move of the mouse causes the cursor to move, so there's data being read in and interpreted. Then it has to go into RAM, and then it has to go up to the output device and move that little pointer every time you move it. So as I do this with the mouse, there's a lot of input going in there. But it's not meaningful input to humans, so we don't think about it much. There's the things you can do with a mouse. I'm not going to go into that. I do want to make the point that there's going to be a video I'd like you to look at about an individual using the first mouse ever developed. He even talks about it in the video. He says, I can't remember why we called it a mouse, but it kind of looks like one. It sits there, gray, with a tail. Anyhow, and he's in San Francisco. The computers are in LA, and he's showing us all the things we take for granted now, but this was back in the late 50s, early 60s, I believe. So I want you to take a look at that video. Different ways to use the mouse. This is a trackball, and what that is a mouse that doesn't move. You just move this ball around, and the pointer moves according to that ball. Another one is a touchpad, which most of us have on our laptop, because we don't want to carry a mouse around, and we can get pretty darn good with that touchpad. We all know what that is. And then there's this one. There's a little red dot in here, pointing stick. And laptops used to come with those, and they don't very much anymore. Some still do, but most of them don't. And that would allow you to move the cursor, we call it mouse cursor, around on the screen just by moving a little red rubber dot, tiny one. So with just one finger, you could move the mouse all over the screen. When I used to travel a lot and did work on the planes, that came in handy because it was difficult to use a mouse on a plane. And a touchpad was even more, was better, but not as good as this because you barely just move your finger and you can move the mouse around. Anyhow, just different kinds of devices, input devices. Nothing special. You're used to seeing this stuff. Touch screen. I'm using a touch screen right now. Although it's only sensitive to the pen. It's an interesting kind of touch screen. Your phone probably has a touch screen. Most phones do. Every time you use something like this, it's a touch screen, of course. Why do you think they have touch screens at places like this? It's obvious on your phone. What's the reason? You don't want to carry around a keyboard, and or a mouse. So if you didn't have a touch screen, and the early phones did not have them, and they were still useful, but they're much more useful with the touch screen. And of course, same thing here. Why would you want a keyboard sitting around asking people to type things? Because it's just another device to break, somebody to steal. It kind of makes this a self-contained unit. Very important for the growth of kiosks. This kind of thing is a kiosk. And the sorts of devices you see in stores. ATM machines. There's a couple other examples. This is just a touch screen, but Microsoft gave it a different name, and everybody's excited about it because it's big. Well, it's the same technology. It's bigger. And then there's these things, an iPod. What is that, a mini? I don't know. And it doesn't have a touch screen per se. It has this pad, which is touch sensitive, so you can do things with it. I've got one of the first iPods, and it used that technology as well. Then there's pen input. I now often use a stylus on my phone. Works better than my fat finger. This seems more accurate. But you don't need one, but I think it works better, so I use it on my phone. I'm using this pen, of course. And over here, when I go to Walmart here in town and use my tech credit card, I have to sign for it, and they have a machine that allows me to put my signature in. It accepts my signature, touchpad. And here's another big area that most of us don't get a chance to use often, and that's graphics. Designers, architects, landscape artists, people designing machines, people designing circuit boards. They'll use a graphics tablet which is this thing here, and then they'll move a pen around it, and the results are seen up here. And that software becomes very sophisticated in that you can use existing objects and explode them or shrink them, and it's quite a sophisticated thing. Without the touchpad or a touchscreen, not possible. And other inputs. Again, just making the point, anything going in, treating the phone as a computer or a device, anything going in is input. I don't need to go through these. It's kind of obvious. If you've never seen one of these, and I've never seen one in person, I've read about them. It's a device that reads the tabletop. So there's no keyboard really there. It's a virtual keyboard, and you just type on it like a regular keyboard, but there's no keyboard. This device sends out infrared and reads where your fingers move and causes typing. Just input, just fancy input. Nothing big about it. Game controllers are also input. Again, making the point. Anything going into the computer is input. Guitar Hero, the guitar is an input device, obviously. The pad you dance on, input device. Of course, they're gone away from these with the Connect. Shoot, what is it? I just forgot. But there's a device now that reads 3D movement in the room, and the game will interpret that as input. So you don't have to have a dance pad anymore. You use the device. Input devices, nothing fancy about it. I want to use the camera here for a little bit to talk in more detail about input, how it actually happens. All of these senses, all of these things going in, we've talked about the fact we just want instructions and data to go into the computer. And that's all that went in originally. It's all a computer can do. And then somebody decided, well, why can't we get an image on the computer? So we started getting icons and things like that. And then somebody said, well, how about a picture? How do we get that in the computer? And we had to go through a whole process. We as people, as human beings, engineers had to develop a way to take the light waves like the eye does, interpret the waves, and put it into the computer as data. And the camera will do that, of course. So if you think about the eye we looked at earlier, the camera works in the same way. This has film. It's hard to buy film anymore, but what we have instead, and you get the idea, there's a lens in your eye here. The retina would be the back plane where the film is. Iris and pupil would be the aperture in here, how much light goes in, and so forth and so on. But this next slide is digital. Not film, but digital photography. The lens setup, everything but the film works in a similar fashion. The difference, of course, is we have to interpret 3D reality and write it on a device. Now remember, computers only understand digits, zeros and ones. So everything we do, and we'll talk about this when we talk about data, the actual way we store data. But today we're just talking about the actual input process. But if you think about the plane, this is a plane. So the light moves in, and we have this filter, if you will, mosaic filter it's called here. And the waves are hitting that, and what we need to do now is take that wave and figure out a way to interpret it. Now a wave runs like this. Let's say it's a kind of a sine wave, sort of. And what we have is a device down here, or that mosaic filter, if you will. And remember, the wave is moving. And it moves across the device. Let me just change where the device is here. Put the device here. So it's sensing, what it's doing is reading the amplitude of the wave as it moves across. Since I can't move this, let's just say the device is here and it's reading the wave like this. And it takes a reading. So we get readings of the height of the wave, and we also can figure out the breadth of the wave. But anyhow, we take a reading. The questions become, how often are we going to take a reading? How accurate do we want to have this reading? The human eye takes it all in and sends it to the brain in a certain way. We need to decide on a computer. So what we do is take these readings, and these readings are really dots along this curve. And that, where that reading is on the curve, you get the idea. So they're just dots. We can never reproduce the wave as accurately as it happened. It's impossible with computers. We have limitations. However, we can take more readings, and the more readings we take, the more accurate we get. So that's the decision point. How many readings are we going to take? Part of that is how many can we physically take? How many can this device down here actually read in the time it takes the wave to move across the device? All right? So the more readings we take, the closer we can reproduce that wave. I hope this is making sense. And we talk about that as resolution with photography. Resolution is how accurately we can reproduce the original image. The more dots we have in our file, the more accurate or the higher the resolution. What you need then, of course, is what information happens here at these dots. Well, we could just decide black or white, you know, like the rods. I can't remember. Whatever the cells in the eye, the rods or cones, that read black and white, that's their job. They give us depth. They don't give us color. We could just do that. So that'd be 2, 0, and 1 for each dot. That's all we'd need. 0 and a 1. 0 being white, let's say, and 1 being black. And that would not be, we could take a lot of dots, and there'd just be one switch or bit, it's called a binary digit, for each dot. But what if we wanted to get color? Okay, let's get color. Well, there's one way to do it, and that's red, green, blue. Because with light, you mix those, and you can, theoretically, in different combinations, you can get every color you want. So you'd need to keep track of the red level, the green level, and the blue level, and the black and white level. Now we've got 4 bits of information about one dot. But we want to get, that's okay. So now we can do color, but we want it to be rich color. So now we start thinking about more shades across here. How many different temperatures of color, how many different types of color do we want to get? How many shades, how many hues, tints? Excuse me. So we have this device down here, over the years, has become more accurate and can read the light waves more accurately. So now we have what we call 64-bit color. So this was 4. Now for each dot, we're keeping 64 bits of information on really high resolution computers. That way we can reproduce it very accurately. Each dot has 64 bits of information. Intensity, hue, tint, all these things are recorded, and that's for each dot. So you can imagine this video camera that's recording me right now is doing a heck of a lot of information. It has across the screen, let me just go over there for a second. On this video image, it's taking readings. These are called pixels. From the word picture element. Each of the dots is a pixel. There's a lot more than that. There's more than I can make. They're so small I can't reproduce them here, but you get the idea. This image of me talking is made up of dots, and each of those dots, information is recorded, and it's stored. The camera then takes those dots, those bits, sends them up the line to our server, where it is recorded on the server as a video file, and then you're playing it back right now. So you're taking your computer, or our server, takes those stored bits and reconverts them into bits, pixels, that are just sent down the line, And then your computer interprets those bits and is displaying them on your monitor right now. It's a heck of a long process, and there's a lot going on. Again, thank God the computer works so fast. It's so inefficient. By the way, if you ever wonder where Pixar got its name, it's picture art from Pixels, Pixar. They do digital movies. So each of these pixels has information recorded about it. This one would be some kind of brown. My shirt would be white, and so forth and so on. This would be some kind of pink. You get the idea. And each of those pixels is recorded. This is getting a little complicated, but just to take one more little step, we use some software called Flash, which was developed by Macromedia years ago, now owned by Adobe. And Flash is very smart. It takes this video image and compares and takes, every time it takes a slice of the wave, it compares that dot to what that dot was last time, even more processing, and only stores information that changes from one frame, we call it, to the next. And that saves data. That's one of the very efficient things about Flash. It only stores changes. So if I don't move, it doesn't actually store any information. It just continues to show the same dots. Something to think about. The more movement there is in a Flash video, the bigger the file gets, in other words. A lot going on. Just as an aside, the light in this room is fluorescent, which gives a green kind of tinge to everything, as you can see if you look at the video. My brain, though, just converts that, so I see everything in this room. I don't pay attention to that green tinge, but you see it more as you're looking at the video, because your brain can't interpret that quite as easily. Okay, so two things we need to consider when we talk about resolution. The higher the resolution, the more storage we need, because the more data we're storing. In other words, more data equals more resolution. So there's two things to think about. How many dots or pixels? All right, how many dots are we taking? We're talking about a sound wave. This picture. We've got the dot here. How many dots are we going to do? That's what I'm talking about when we talk about how many pixels. How many of those are we going to take? Okay, per second, per millisecond, per 10, whatever it is. How many pixels am I going to generate? And the second thing is how much data for each pixel. So if I just want to do what we call black and white or grayscale, I'm going to use fewer bits per pixel, but I may have the same number of dots. So it's a combination of these two things. It's this times that. 1 times 2 is how many bits we need, and that is how much storage we have. So if you take a picture in your camera, a megapixel is 1,000,000 pixels. That's for one frame. 1,000,000 pixels to take one picture. And then, of course, you've got 2.4. I don't know what they go up to now. They continue to go up. And that's a function of the fact that storage or memory on your camera has gotten cheaper. And the cheaper it gets, the more we can record on your camera and the more we can do. If you don't have much memory left on your camera, you can change the resolution on your camera. There's a setting usually. And each picture will take fewer pixels and less information about each pixel is really what's going on. Both of those things. And therefore, you'll be able to store more pictures on your camera, but the pictures won't be as high a quality. So it depends on what if you're taking pictures of your car to put on eBay or something like that. I don't know how high a resolution that needs to be, but if you're taking pictures of your family, you probably want them high pixels so you can send it to grandma and print it out on a piece of paper and it still looks good. I'm just trying to, I hope you understand the trade-off. It's resolution versus storage. Higher the resolution, the more storage. It's that simple. Because the higher the resolution, the more information we need. And just to be clear, this diagram here, although I was talking about light, it works the same way for music, audio. Audio is a wave. So the question is, how many slices am I going to take of that audio wave as it moves across our sensor, number one. And number two, how much information am I going to store for each of those time slices? It's the same concept. And just to be, one more thing. When we moved to digital audio, we used to have a phonograph record, and that was a disc, a vinyl. I know this is all new to many of you. And on this disc, a track was cut, and it was one continuous track and went to the center of the disc. Then we had a phonograph arm and a needle that came out here. The end of the needle, or arm, was a needle, usually diamond, because you didn't want it to wear out, diamond chip. And you would then put the needle on the front, and it would start moving inward because it would get in this groove, and the needle would follow that groove. And as it did, that needle would move back and forth, up and down. And that's what would create the sound. The arm would interpret that movement back and forth, up and down, as sound, and send it to the amplifier, which would then come out of the speakers. It was all done in what we call analog manner. Well, as we know, things don't work that way anymore. We now have digital music. First we had CD. Well, let's just back up a second. First we had the vinyl, then we went to tape, 8-track, which was odd technology, but it was tape. Cassette, which was tape. Tape stored a wave, a magnetic wave, however. And as that wave went across a magnet, a head, tape head, it would interpret that wave, creating signals to go to the computer. All done in analog again. Well, now we do have digital. And the first digits were CDs, as you all know. I haven't bought a CD in, 4 years. You probably don't buy them very often either. We download the digits. Okay? We go to a music service and download what we want, and then we can play it on any of our digital devices. That's the beauty of this. It's very portable. Once we have it on our computer, we can put it on any kind of device. I have music on my phone. I have music on an iPad. I have music on my computer and on whatever you want to put it on my Samsung Galaxy, on my iPad. So iPod, iPad, phone. Once you get things in digits, the flexibility of how you can output that information just goes up exceedingly. Of course, storage. I have, now 16,000 tracks in my music library. That takes up a heck of a lot of space because all those digits have to be stored. That's okay. It's a good, fair trade-off. If I had those in LPs, it would take up half my house. So that's the beauty of it. The downside, according to many people, and it is true, the sound of digital music is not as rich as analog music. And that's a fact. I mean, people debate about it. As we talked about earlier, the wave, we can't capture that wave. We can take a lot of readings and get close. We just can't do the wave because we've got digits. And digits are, it's a sound that comes out here, 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 here. It's not a continual sound. That's what analog is. But what's happened is usually we listen to music in a car, There's so much sound anyways and noise. It doesn't matter how good the quality is. We still listen to it at home, but not like we used to. I mean, in the 60s, 50s, 60s, people were spending thousands of dollars on hi-fi systems. We don't do that much anymore. We don't care. I mean, people will spend money on Bose speakers and things. I'm just talking about a system. And we listen to music on headphones, earbuds. It sounds great. And we don't compare it very often to the analog, so what difference does it make? So we've all made a trade-off, whether you know it or not. The quality of what we listen to has gone down. That's a given. But that's okay, because it solves so many of our other problems and we like it. There are services now that will give you 64-bit digital sound, or they call it high-def sound, high-definition sound, and you can find those if you're willing to pay a little more, and of course it's more storage for your music. The next step, and we'll talk about this I suppose later, but there's a thing called cloud storage or computing, and we'll talk about more of that when we talk about data. Briefly, I want to mention this because it's part of this whole audio explosion we're experiencing right now. If you have CDs, they're becoming obsolete. And the same thing is happening with video. DVDs and Blu-ray are becoming obsolete because you can download the same quality. That's the difference now. You can download high-def blue disc quality for your video and play it off your computer. You don't have to own a thing anymore. You own the rights to these digits and you can play them. So DVDs, Blu-ray are becoming obsolete as CDs are. A few years, you're not going to see fewer of them. But my daughter loves to save discs, so she has a whole room for them. She continues to buy them because she wants to have them. I don't say anything because that's what I did with music. I had 1,500 CDs that I had to convert from CD to digital. It took me a while, and that's the way that's okay. That's what people do. Now there's services where you can take your PC disc, digital music, copy it to the cloud, it's called, to some service, and then you can listen to it wherever you are. Okay? And you've heard of these things. The one I use, I use Amazon. They have a cloud service, and all my music is stored at Amazon. If I download music to my computer, over the course of the next day or so, it all gets moved up to Amazon's cloud automatically. I don't have to do anything. What that means to me is I used to have to, when I traveled, carry an iPod with me, and if I wanted to play certain music, eventually I'd fill up the iPad no matter how much it had, and I would have to make a decision to take with me. I don't have to anymore. All of my music is in the Amazon cloud. I can play it off my phone as long as I had phone service. I pay a price. It's all data, and as you know, data plans are a big part of the cost of phones. I think it's worth it. So that's Amazon. Google has one. I also have my music in the Google Cloud. I don't use it very often because it's free, so I did it. And there's other services too, which I can't think of right now. But there's a whole industry growing up around this. There's also music services. There's one called Spotify, which is a European-based one. And my whole library is put into Spotify, so I can play it just like the others. The difference is Spotify, and you've all, I assume, have heard of Pandora. Well, Spotify took the Pandora approach and took it a step further. Almost any music you've ever heard of is available on Spotify. And for one fee a month, you can play any music you want to. And since joining Spotify, I think I should spend $9 a month on that. I haven't purchased any CDs or downloaded any music. I don't need to. New album comes out, I can go on Spotify, find that album, and play it on my phone for free. Well, I mean, for the $9 fee. Spotify takes care of paying the fees, the royalties to the artist. So just all of that stems from this input idea of turning audio to digits. Okay, and I got carried away there, but it's an interesting concept because that's the way our lives are going. Digits make us much more flexible. So the light for the photograph, coming back to the topic at hand, runs through these filters, image sensor, and eventually is stored on an SD card or some form of storage. And that's turning the waves. As the waves hit these things, it interprets the waves and all the things I talked about. Each of these does something a little different. It focuses, the digital image processing and so forth. And then it, excuse me, it splits the colors into red, green, blue, or even more as you get into more different details. Sorry. And these are the heart of it, these CCD devices. They're, where's it, charge-coupled device. So as the electrons of the light, we talk about light as waves, but it's really electrons moving in waves. The intensity of the electrons hitting the charge-coupled device tells the device, the CCD, how bright the image should be, that pixel should be. And that becomes digits then. And the charge-coupled device converts it to digits. That's about all I want to say about that. Here's the trade-off. Resolution versus number of bits. Again. Voice input. Well, we have voice input right here. I'm speaking. It's going into a microphone and getting interpreted. So voice input is the same idea. My voice is a wave, and we take the bits and so forth. And it's stored in a file, and you play it back. Okay. Just like music, it's no different than music really to the computer. The other thing I wanted to talk about is voice recognition. And I have on my laptop Dragon. Been around for, gosh, 10, 12 years, and they keep improving it. Essentially what Dragon does is as you speak, it attempts to figure out where each word begins and ends, number one. Then it takes the pattern of that word, so pattern, that creates a certain set of digits. So when I say pattern, it creates a pattern of digits, which it then compares against a database and says that's the word pattern, and displays that word on the monitor, or creates the ASCII code set, which we'll talk about later. That's how we store information on the hard disk. So voice recognition is an attempt to figure out what the words are. The sound for music is just digits, it's just data. My voice into this microphone is just digits, it's just data. Voice recognition is trying to figure out not only the words, but then the meaning of the words. And the science has advanced tremendously. This Dragon, I can run my laptop with it. I don't usually. But I can tell it, Dragon, browse the internet for digital music. It'll bring up a browser. It'll go to a search engine, whichever one I have specified, and it will type in digital music and then do a search. And then I can say to it, go to the fifth one, and it'll go down to the fifth link and go to that website. It's fantastic. It's better, of course, it's great if you're writing papers, you can just talk and it puts it in there. And what you have to do to make this work, just to be clear, is I had to train Dragon to my voice originally when I installed it. Everybody speaks differently. Can you imagine being able to understand the way I speak, which is basically a Midwestern accent, I believe, and then trying to get the same meaning out of the same word from somebody that's from the Scottish Highlands? It's difficult. It's almost another language sometimes. I have been, in parts of Britain where people were speaking English to me and I couldn't understand a word they were saying. So the software, it's even worse for them because we had a context. I was asking the farmer about something and he was telling me about foxes and taking his sheep. I don't know what he was saying, but he went on for 10 minutes and I just nodded my head. Well, this software has to figure out a way to understand that person that buys the software. So it gives you things you read, specific set of text, and based on that specific set of text, it can build your way of speaking. So it has my patterns actually in there as opposed to just generic patterns. And it associates those patterns with the text that you've read. And depending on your accent and so forth, you may have to read more or less than somebody. And as you create documents, if it makes a mistake, you go back and tell it what you really said. and you can correct, and then it gets better as time goes on. So in a sense, it learns. It learns your accent and your way of using speech. All based on digits, creating digits for my voice, which are compared against patterns in a database. That's voice recognition. And this goes on a lot. You can most of us can do something with our phone, and Siri, and my BlackBerry years ago had something as good as Siri. BlackBerry just doesn't advertise it, and my Samsung Galaxy has some kind of voice-activated thing which I don't use. But so audio input, we've talked a lot about this. Different audio, it's all data. There is a way to play music, and the computer captures it and then writes the music. Software will allow you to do that. That's nice because you can just compose on the keyboard and it'll create the file, the data, digital file for you. Just to be clear on that. Video works the same way as we talked about, the waves. It takes a time slice, records it. And of course, it's obvious. Right now, I'm kind of doing this. The video from that camera is going into this computer. It's being interpreted as digits, and then it's sent to our server, which actually creates the data it stores. So one signal is sent from the computer, so my CPU and computer has to do some of the work. But then the server, the Adobe Connect server we have down the hall here, stores the actual file of data that you play back later. But the concept's the same as for the camera, it's just a little more complex. Okay, nothing magical about it. You should know what a webcam is. Sometime this semester, I'm going to ask each of you to connect with me live for a discussion with a webcam or something, and then we'll see how that goes. I just want you to experience it. Video conference, kind of what we do, all the other classes we do here in Distance Ed are sent out live, and there's interaction between the student and this classroom. We're in the students here and the professor here. Many of the classes, the professor requires the student to have a camera and mic, and they interact. Maybe I'll show you some examples of those. I'll put some links up for you. But every Distance Ed class we do, with the exception of the MST program, we do live. There are other devices around campus that just record things, and people can watch recordings. So those are the three things we do here: live, which also has recordings, and then this sort of thing. And then we also have another setup that's not Adobe Connect. It's called Media Site. And those devices are $20,000 a pop, one for each room. So it's a very expensive way to go, and it doesn't do live very well. So webcam, video conference, and some of the way, you've heard of these. There's Skype. Some of you might have heard of Polycom. That's how we used to do Distance Ed with other people. Now we use Adobe Connect. In a sense, there's Net Meeting and so forth. Those are all services that allow you to do video conferencing. Been around for years. When I was working at Kinko's, I was in charge of the project to get a video conferencing room in every Kinko's, or not every Kinko's, but in major markets. We were charging $100 an hour for video conferencing. And people did use it at the time. That's how people would talk to their family who were overseas in the military. They would come in if they wanted to on birthdays and things, and they would get a room essentially, and they would use video conferencing. But it was a very expensive thing, and the phone company had to be involved. All the data moved over phone lines, not over the internet. Whole different process than it is today, but it worked. Our major customer was a company called Korn Ferry, who was doing, they're a job placement service. In other words, they find people for companies. And they saved a ton of money, even at $100 an hour, by having people come into the local Kinko's, and they would do the preliminary interviews via the video conferencing. And they would only fly the people that were the best, 2 or 3, in for in-person interviews. So it saves money, and that's why you're seeing more of this. 2 reasons. The bandwidth on the internet's getting so much better, we can handle the video. Video takes more data than audio. And then when you add audio to video, you've got a lot of data moving up the line. And these services have found ways to deal with that. And I'm sure you've all used one of those. If not, we're going to use one of them this semester so you can see how it works. So the internet's gotten, the bandwidth's gotten better, and the technology has reduced the need for bandwidth. There's techniques of compressing video and sending it up the line and uncompressing it and so forth, which we won't go into. But that has also made Skype and businesses like that available, possible, economical. Scanners. This is the same technique, really, as a camera. The CCD in a camera came from the original copier machines. Very similar, although some of those use static electricity, but the more modern ones use CCD. It does the same thing as a camera. You put a piece of paper on here and it reads the pixels. All right? Converts it to digital information transmitted, and you have an image of a piece of paper. It's about the same process as taking a picture. It just can take more pixels because it can take longer and it scans back and forth rather than doing it all at once like a camera. It goes zzz, zzz, zzz. So it's doing the pixels in a lot more detail. OCR. This is becoming less and less important with since most things are becoming online. But once upon a time, and it's still important to some people, you wanted to be able to take a document like this, put it through a certain kind of scanner or an OCR, optical character recognition scanner, and read the information off of it. Why we wanted to do that is people were typing, you would send in your monthly statement with a check, and the key punch operator, there was careers, nothing but key punch, would type all that data into the computer, your account number, the date, amount of the check, et cetera, et cetera. And then that would go into the computer, and then those transactions would be posted against the database, et cetera, et cetera. Well, with the OCR, the idea was, well, we can read the document. We don't need to type it. That's essentially the way it works. It generally uses a specific character set to make it easier. This is normally what we do with computers. We dumb things down. We're using this specific character set. It's easier to see what character is what. That's an OCR, used less and less these days. However, again, at Kinko's, I was in charge of starting a business, believe it or not, where we would scan a whole room boxes. We had an automatic scanner where you could stack paper in it. It would just scan them one after another, put them in a database. And it was doing some of this. We didn't recognize every word, but we would ask them for keywords they wanted to find. And we would, as we scanned, keep track of where that word is. So really a big deal for law offices. If big court cases, especially civil suits, it's all about the paperwork, the paper trail. Well, before things became so digital where we could search digitally, there would be boxes of paper, and each law firm would have to go through that paper. They would hire people to go through and try to find things, and, oh, we forgot, let's go back through and look for this. Well, what we did was scanned all the paperwork in, and then that law firm, whether it was the defense or the prosecution, would have an advantage over the other people, because they paid us to do this, and they could search that information. And we would scan for keywords, and they could just click on a word and go right to the pages where those words were, and they could find them. And they could find the original documents too if they wanted to. It was a great advantage for people. Now it's probably happening less and less. This is test taking. You've all done this. Iowa Basic Skills. You mark a box. That's all that is. I don't remember what it's called. What is that called? Optical mark recognition. Okay. Barcode reader. This is a barcode. And these are laser lights reading a barcode at the grocery store. What does that do? Well, what it's doing is getting this number here on the side. See that number? And you can find that in almost any product these days. The barcode is the same thing as that number. It's just represented this way. Laser reads that, and now it knows what item that is. It knows it's a can of Campbell's soup. I can't tell what flavor it is. The advantage? Well, the advantage of that is The price is pulled from a database, essentially. Several advantages. It used to be the clerk had to type in the price. So the clerk had to know the price, or the price had to be stamped on the can of soup. You had to know what it was, and often a lot of mistakes. Now the price comes from a database, and it's very accurate. In fact, we use this idea for our frequent shopper card. We would have sales from 10 to 11. We could lower all the prices in the database by 10% for an hour. And then it went through the cash register, got a 10% sale, and then we would turn it off at 11 to try to even out our traffic throughout the day, for instance. The idea is once it's digitized again, you can do more with it. You had the database of prices you could do things with. Your phone can read barcodes. They're usually a little different. There's all kinds of barcodes, by the way. But we're more familiar with this kind, and now this kind. And often you'll see in excuse me, magazines this kind of barcode. You have your phone scan it with an app, you'll get something free, or you'll get registered for something without having to type in all your information. RFID, radio frequency identification it's called, is sometimes controversial, but a few years ago, Walmart told every one of their vendors delivering goods to their stores they'd have to equip everything with RFID. What it is, it's a piece of equipment, a tiny piece of strip of reactive plastic, metal. And there's two kinds. There's the passive, which doesn't have any power in it. And as the radio wave goes over it of a specific frequency, it gives you the barcode number, essentially. Think of it in those terms. So, as long as the tag was there, you can read the code and the price by radio. So what does that mean? It means you don't have to use a laser scanner. Your shopping cart full of goods, you can bring it up to the front, and the RFID reads the whole cart in one swoop. So imagine you walk up with your cart to the cashier. Every item in the cart is read and priced, and your ticket spits out. You're done. You don't have to read each item. It's a really good, efficient way of doing things. The other advantage, of course, is in inventory. I worked at grocery for a few years, and when the semi-trailer, 18-wheeler, would come from the manufacturers, the distributors, we physically had to go. You got to physically unload the truck, even today. We can't get around that. The difference is the truck pulls up now, the RFID tells us what's on that truck. We look at the order we sent them, and do they agree or not? We know instantly before we even open the truck. And what we didn't get, and the things that are on that truck that we didn't want, those kinds of things. So you can reconcile stuff without a lot of labor. Now the unloading process is just getting the boxes off and putting them in the back of the store. Used to be you had to scan everything as it came off the truck by hand. So it's a big process. Now, it's a great advantage, time saver, and it's more accurate. The military uses it. You get a Hercules plane, which is a cargo plane, full of stuff. When it leaves the port in the States, it has RFID, so you know what was put on it. That is sent to wherever the plane is going. When it lands, they can read the RFID on that plane and say, oh, I know what shipment that is, and everything's here, and they know what they got. That can be very crucial in the middle of a battle when you need to find certain ordnance or equipment, and you need to get it somewhere. You can just go through a warehouse and find it without having to search. You can put it on a map based on the RFID. It's very important technology. The pushback has come. People feel like, and there's another form that I should mention, RFID also has an active kind of tag that has a power source, and it transmits a signal. So in order to cut down on theft in stores, essentially these RFID tags, after you scan them, allow you to leave the store without an alarm going off. So if somebody tries to leave the store without getting it scanned, in other words, they're paying for it, they'll get caught. Well, people have taken that another step and said, well, now they're going to drive trucks around our homes and scan our homes and find out what we have in there, and we're going to lose more privacy. So it's a real concern for some people, but I don't know. I don't care if somebody knows how much bread I have in my house. If there's other things I don't want them to know that are personal, but I'm not going to put RFID tags on those. So I don't know. It's a controversial thing. And the next step, of course, and you can see some of the things you can do here, times for marathon runners. Well, people used to cheat at the Boston Marathon. They'd get in a car and drive around to the next bend and pretend they'd been running the whole way. And you cannot do that anymore because you have RFID and you have to stay on the track and your time is constantly updated. They sell the idea now, if you have somebody running in the Boston Marathon, for instance, you can track their time on the web, even though you can't see them. Even if you're there, you can track their time and see where they are on the course and so forth. It makes long races like that much more exciting for people watching. Soldiers, wardrobe, airline baggage, they're now using it and so forth. Anything you need to track, you can do much easier now. Here's a active RFID chip. And here's what they've done to it. They've put it in this person's hand. That kind of concerns people a lot more than their groceries being tagged. On the other hand, we've been using these things in pets for a long time. If your pet gets lost and a vet or a pound finds them, they can scan the pet if you have one of these in them, and they'll call you on the phone. We have your dog. It's kind of nice. Recently, I was thinking about this. A child was kidnapped somewhere in the U.S., and I thought, well, imagine if they had something like that, how much easier they could find that child or track that child. So I don't want people knowing where I am every minute of every day, but there seems to be some applications that might be a good thing. I don't know. But it's coming, and it's getting more and more widespread. People worried about their children are starting to think about using this kind of thing. So we'll see. This symbol here says this passport has an RFID chip in it. And the U.S. is starting to move to that, and they're trying to get other countries to move that way too. They think it's much more accurate. It's much more difficult to forge something like this because there's a code in here kept by the U.S. government that's difficult to counterfeit. So it should make things easier. And this woman is doing inventory with this device, and she's reading the RFID tags. Rather than counting them 1, 2, 3, 4, she's just going, oh, there's this many of those things. Okay. So the information she gets gives her the product code and how many. And so that's all she needs. Much quicker way to do inventory, and it's more accurate. Smart cards. Talking about input. This is a smart chip. And when I was in Japan teaching at an Air Force base there, the military ID cards were starting to switch to smart cards. And the advantage was when you came to the gate, you didn't even have to take your card out of your wallet. They could just read it in your wallet, although they usually did just to see the picture on it. But the other advantage is they were starting to think about putting all your medical records on here, on your ID card. The advantage of that is that if you've ever been in the military and you move station to station, you used to have to carry your records with you. Well, if you can put the records on here, you can take them with you. The real use for these things, however, is in credit cards. Harder to, yeah, you can have this number here and try to buy something, but it isn't going to work unless the chip is there as well. So that's the idea of the chip. And the chip can be updated, changed. You're starting to see these things. Europe is using smart cards almost exclusively with credit cards. And it's a problem for Americans going to Europe because we're still using an older technology called a magnetic strip we'll look at in a second. There's a lot more you can do with these. You can make these cards much more flexible. You can program them to do things. You can limit things. You can expand things. There's a lot you can do with it. You could go to somewhere and get money loaded on it and give it to somebody, and then as they spend it, it goes away, like the gift cards we use. The other thing you can do is this. This is a Visa card, but it has a calculator in it because this smart chip on this card has a processor. When I did the frequent shopper card for the grocery store, we experimented with some of this stuff where you could always tell how many, quote, points you had or dollars you had on your frequent shopper card. There'd be a display. That's what this is. You can load it up with stuff by paying, or you could use it at a grocery store, or you could use it at a movie theater. It's kind of cool. McDonald's experimented with this for a while too. You could load extra points for people. It just is a more flexible way of doing credit cards. The downside is there is a possibility somebody could hack into this as you're walking down the street. How big a threat that is, I don't know. I don't have that much credit, so I don't know what it would do you to go to all that trouble. But if you're sitting on a street corner getting thousands of credit cards as people walk by, now you have an illicit business. So there is an issue there, and the response has been capitalism is great. You can buy a sleeve to put your card in that makes the signal from the smart card, smart chip, doesn't go beyond that billfold, if you will. This is what we're more used to, magnetic stripe. Card readers, well, if you go to Europe, this can be a problem if you're an American. Your credit card has this, and they're converting mostly to the smart technology. And it can be an issue because they'll look at that and say, I can't even read it. So now they got to type in a number. There's just problems, and they're expecting us to change, and I don't hear any movement in this country to change. Okay, real quick. Magnetic ink across the bottom of your check. Of course, that's another thing that's becoming obsolete. I probably wrote 4 checks last year, if that. I do everything online. But at the bottom of your check, there's magnetic ink, and this is read by a Micker reader, and we did that with our payroll checks when I worked at the grocery store. And people that know, if they don't want a check to be processed very quickly, you can run a magnet across this and kind of screw it up, and then the check has to be entered manually, so it takes a couple more days. I didn't tell you that, though. So data collection devices, we've all seen these. You're going to find more and more waitresses using these, too. They're going to come to the table with those and taking your order when it's transmitted somewhere, and then the cook starts, before she even leaves your table, the cook has the order. Okay, you're going to see it more and more, but it's the same idea as an RFID. In fact, this could be an RFID reader, or it could be a barcode reader, whatever it is. We get these, you probably get them too, when FedEx is delivered to my office. We have a guy on campus that brings the deliveries around, the packages, and I have to sign a device just like this. And you get it at home too, they'll have you sign it. And your signature goes in digitally. We all know about that. Biometric input. We've been talking about this for distance education. How do we know if the person taking the test is the one we think it is? The person taking the course is the one we think it is? Well, biometrics might be a way to do that. It's just a way to, oops, sorry, hit the wrong button there. Biometrics is a way to make sure the person, it reads some part of your body and allows us to verify that. You cannot change your fingerprint, for instance. So we might have a fingerprint reader that's going to read your thumbprint or a fingerprint. And that way we know who you are. There's actually software that does facial recognition. It takes, just like on a fingerprint's a pattern, and it takes certain dot points around it. Same with a face. It tries to find the bones behind the flesh, because the bones are more difficult to change, and match that with a pattern of your face. There are some problems with this. It helps, but it isn't 100% accurate. They had one in the Miami airport after 9/11 to see if they could track suspects. They took it out. It didn't work very well, and they were stopping all kinds of people. So they're still working on that. Your hand, shape of your hand, voice, your signature. Wow, my signature is hideous. I'm not sure how that would work. And retinal scan, believe it or not, is the most accurate. And that's reading the blood vessels in the back of your eye, the pattern of the blood vessels. This is a retinal scan. That might be a diseased retina, but it's an image I could find. So what they did, I could find. Then the pattern of these blood vessels is what they look for, much similar to a fingerprint. I don't know why, I don't quite understand it, but they say this is more accurate than fingerprints. We can share more things on the fingerprint than we do in the retina. And this is facial recognition. They're taking points along the face, putting them in a pattern. It's all about putting it in a pattern. Same thing here. Find a pattern, match it to a database. Same with this. Of course, with this, they're going to scan you, put your name in, and the next time you come in, they'll scan you again. Same with the fingerprints. So, and you can actually buy these. They're not expensive. If you don't want your kids using your computer, use a fingerprint reader, and it only responds to your fingerprint. No one else can get in. This guy's getting his iris read or retina. So biometrics, it's about something in your body you can't change. Of course, in the movies, you see things where they cut off a guy's finger and use his thumbprint anyways, but I don't know. Terminals, input. Self-service grocery that you're inputting. You're doing the same thing the cashier's doing, but that's an input device. ATMs, input device. This looks like Redbox, I think. Input device, obviously. I'm not going to go through this, but when you get a system, you should think about what you need to input. 7 megapixel digital camera for home use. What do they got here? 8 megapixel for home bot. You get the idea. What are you going to do with it? 9 to 12 megapixels. I think they've gone beyond that now. But okay, so physically challenged people, we're just about done here. Keyboard's bigger. Web camera, voice recognition. I have a friend, member of his family has a disease where she can't control her movements, so she uses the computer, but she uses the voice dragon. And she can browse the internet, create documents, send emails, whatever it is she wants to do. Windows operating system comes with ways to change the display in such a way if you can still see but you're legally blind, you can make the characters look huge. You can reverse the contrast so the characters are white and the background's black. All kinds of things you can do in Windows settings to make it easier to use. In fact, in Word, I believe it'll read it out loud if you want it to. Character recognition, OCR. It's not reading it optically, but it's reading the digits and saying them out loud. Dragon will do that too. You can say, open file resume and read it to me, and it will read it to you. Email. Every time you get an email, it reads the email. My phone does that, actually. And Google Voice, if you've ever used it, will actually take your voicemail and send you an email and try to understand the voicemail and send you text to your phone. So there's a lot of things that we can do to help people that have physical issues with their senses to use the computer. Okay. I think we've covered a lot on input. Next time we'll talk about output, and then we'll have a lecture just on storage. We've just talked about how we're getting all this stuff into the computer. We're digitizing it, storing it in digits. Well, of course, we need a standard way to store that information, that data. Or every computer is going to have different data, and we want to share this data amongst all